Digital addiction is the growing but silent epidemic that's ravaging too many of our kids' brains. We're not talking about a fringe problem here. We're talking about a full-blown psychological assault when it comes to our children and their internet gaming disorder and smartphone addiction. Something like 10% of Australian teens are getting their dopamine hits, cheap dopamine hits, from screens instead of life. It's not just a stat, it's a generation of kids that are being rewired with cheap dopamine right underneath our noses, often in our lounge rooms and in their bedrooms. And in today's episode of the Happy Families podcast, Dr. Brad Marshall, the unplugged psychologist, is going to break down how technology is hijacking our children's mental architecture and what the hell we can do about it. Dr. Brad Marshall is a returning guest to the Happy Families podcast. Brad, the unplugged psychologist, has spent over a decade at the cutting edge of healthy screen use. He's an author, he's a researcher, he's a speaker, he's a clinician. Brad, welcome back to the pod. So good to have you here.
Thank you, Justin. Appreciate it. And I should just clarify there, I'm not doctor yet. I've handed in my PhD thesis, but I'm probably a couple of months off yet. But I appreciate you using that tag early. Thank you. I
reckon if you've handed in the thesis, an almost doctor is close. But I take your point. I won't push the point. So let's talk about this paper that you've just published. This is not going to get geeky. Any parent who's got a child who is on screens and gaming too much, this is going to be relevant for you. But we're going to geek out for about 120 seconds. Brad, you've just published this study about internet gaming disorder and smartphone addiction. Obviously, that's our topic today. Who was in the study? What was the study about?
Yeah, so just top level stuff here. Basically, what we did at Macquarie University at the research lab I'm working at is 689 families joined our study, and they were kids that were from kindergarten to year 12. Now, most of the kids were between year 4 and year 8. That's who sort of volunteered. And what we were asking them is parents to volunteer if you have concerns around smartphone addiction or gaming, video game disorder, or just problematic usage. So parents signed up, 689 of them. And what they received in exchange for signing up was a whole bunch of videos of myself chatting about all the different strategies that I did in my first book, The Tech Diet. And we were offering them education on this stuff and strategies of what you can do to put healthy boundaries around this at home. 6 weeks later, we asked them to fill out a second survey. We had 153 do that. And then we've crunched the numbers on what happened with those 153. Now, we'll just leave for a second the big dropout rate there, because there is a big dropout rate, and we can explain that. But essentially what we found is that 60% of these kids qualified for either smartphone addiction or gaming disorder on bona fide tools that we use at the start, at baseline. So it was a fairly clinical sample. 60% of them were considered clinical. And by the end of it, 60% of the kids that had gaming disorder didn't have it at 6 weeks, and 32% that had it at the start, smartphone addiction, didn't have it at the end. So what we're talking about there is a parent-only intervention trial. I never met a single kid. In fact, Justin, I never even met a single parent. It was just me on videos. So there was no real therapeutic alliance there or holding their hands. It was just information we were giving them. And we feel that those top-line results are pretty encouraging, that parents can have a huge impact on how their kids do stuff online and the impacts there.
So here's my restate of this. Of the 150 parents or thereabouts who filled in that second form, you've got a 1/3 to 2/3 improvement where you've gone from disordered, dysfunctional behavior to my child is now back with it, living a functional, adaptive, healthy life again in relation to the way their screens are going. And the intervention is they've watched a handful of videos with you across a 6-week period and then implemented that themselves. Big finding. Let's talk about this huge dropout, because you've lost, 400 or 500 people from part 1 to part 2.
Correct.
Why do you think so many dropped out, and what does that say about how strong these findings are? Oh, by the way, in a sec, we're going to talk about what the videos said. But let's just address this. Why do you reckon so many people pulled out?
Yeah, so there's a couple of different theories here, but the dropout rate is 77.8%. Okay, so it's significant. It's a limitation of the study. And as a good researcher, of course, you have to, be upfront about those limitations. We're not going to do some selective reporting here and try and wash over that. What I would say is there's a couple of different theories. One theory would be that parents just got really burnt out and didn't implement the strategies. The other theory would be that of those parents that didn't turn up, really there wasn't a whole lot of impetus. There wasn't a whole lot of reward for them to fill out that second survey. So what I mean by that is there was no financial incentive for them to do it. Parents are busy. They get the second survey. They've already got the videos, which typically cost $50 or $60. They got them for free. And they've never met me. They've never met Professor Warburton, who I work with. So there's not really any, I guess, contract for them to actually fill in that second survey. So I do think that's a big part of it, and a more likely scenario.
Brad, thanks for explaining that. There were 5 things that you encouraged parents to do as they worked with their kids in terms of their gaming disorder or their screen addiction challenges. I want to step through those 5, and I'd like to ask you to just talk briefly about each of those 5 things, and to the degree you can, to what extent did each of these things contribute to the positive outcomes, the reductions in dysfunctional behavior that you saw? So the first one is one that I'm a really big believer in, managing the home Wi-Fi with set limits. How's that work, and how does that contribute to the positive outcomes?
Yeah, so basically there were 5 things that we measured as what we call dosage variables here that we were measuring. But there are 7 steps in the Tech Diet for Your Child and Teen book. We were just trying to pick the 5 that were sort of objectively measured in a research sense. So the first one is managing the home Wi-Fi and setting limits around that. That one, and then strategy 2 and 3. So strategy 2 was placing limits on your child's data plan. So again, both of those you'll probably see here, Justin, and this is interesting for the recent social media ban debate and everything. Essentially what we're acknowledging here from a clinical perspective is that parents that are using parental controls on phones and, devices and apps and games, they're incredibly poor. They're poorly designed. There's easy ways to get around them. And, we can go into whether tech companies design them that way on purpose or not. But anyway.
I think they might have. But anyway, go on.
Yeah, I think I'd agree with you. But anyway, so I just want to circumvent that. And these strategies are designed to be right. What fuels all of these devices and their persuasive design and their addictive nature and the dopamine is the Wi-Fi. We know that for a fact. So if the first 2 steps, control your Wi-Fi and control the mobile data, actually had some of the biggest impact that we saw when we broke down the different strategies and what was the most effective. The third strategy of setting clear boundaries around Wi-Fi at bedtime was fairly effective as well. And then we get into the last 2 strategies, which weren't as effective. I mean, some of them had some significance, but it was pretty weak, and it was approaching a bit vague. And I should also mention for all 5 of these, what we really stuck to in the research is just the overall effect, because some parents picked strategy 1 and strategy 5, they all picked different ones. And that was interesting to us, is that they quite often didn't apply all 5 strategies. They might have just picked 2 or 3. But it was about them picking the ones that really work for their situation. So just circling back, strategy 4 was to draw up an agreement for daily screen use with their child. And strategy 5 was about implementing consequences if they break set rules. And so 4 and 5 were not used as much, and they weren't as effective as some of the other ones. But as a whole, all 5 strategies were found to be extremely effective for treating gaming disorder and smartphone addiction.
I'm going to go through these again because there was a lot of information that you just shared, and I want it to be super accessible for parents who are going, I need this, I need more, I just need this. So number 1 was managing the home Wi-Fi with set limits. When we get really practical about that, first of all, every single one of these 5 elements is going to have a conversational component, right? We're going to sit down with our child. We're going to have a discussion. We're worried about this. We know that there's been a lot of contention. There's a lot of discussion ongoingly in the house, but we need to manage the home Wi-Fi with set limits. So the conversation begins. Effectively, what do parents do then? Do they start switching the Wi-Fi off? Is that pretty much it? The Wi-Fi is going to go off between, 8:30 at night and 7:30 in the morning. Is that how that rolls, or is there something more to it?
Yeah, so just around the conversation, so I think that's a really important part. We always try to do this in a clinical sense as a part of a conversation,
of course,
with our teenagers, right? But I should also just quantify here, if you're a parent at home listening to this going, my child won't even sit down and have that conversation with me, then for some of these strategies, these parent strategies are for those parents as well, where you say, well, I'm going to have to go ahead and put these boundaries in place if you're not going to come to the table and discuss it with me.
I've got to jump in here because anyone who's been listening to the Happy Families podcast for a while or following the work that I've done, read it in my books, they will know that as soon as you say that, and parents will do this as well, whether they've listened to me or not, I guess, a lot of parents are just going to chafe and say, no, that's not the way you're supposed to do it. But can I tell you, as much as I hate it, I absolutely agree with you. There are some times where I, as the parenting expert, quote unquote, sometimes I just say to my kids, we've tried to have the conversation about this 4 or 5 times and we're spinning our wheels. I'm the one with the prefrontal cortex that's operational, and I'm going to implement this even though you hate me and you hate it. Why? Because you know that I'm older and you know that I'm wiser and you hate me for it, but that's just the way it's got to be. Doesn't happen very often, but from time to time as a parent, you've just got to be the parent. And I hate saying it, but you're dead right. And I love the fact that this managing the home Wi-Fi with set limits and placing limits on the mobile phone, conversations first where possible. I love that you've highlighted these seem to be the most effective things for breaking the addiction.
And what you find is that in a clinical sense and in this research as well, we found the same thing. When you do strategy 1 and 2 that we've just talked about, quite often what you'll have is that will then open the door to a conversation. Then they'll come back to the bargaining table and kind of go, okay, well, I'm pissed off about this. Can you tell me why?
Yes.
And so for many families at home, don't feel like you can't do the perfect conversation first. Sometimes it has to come second. But to come back to your question, Justin, about how do parents practically do that? Well, there's no perfect way. But for setting Wi-Fi limits, typically what I talk about is using something called a mesh router system, which allows you to, and I'm not going to recommend specific ones, but it allows you to turn on and off certain devices at a macro level without having to turn the entire Wi-Fi off if you don't want to. For strategy 2 of placing limits on your mobile data, there's 2 different ways to do this. And so the first way is at a macro level, you can just go to the telco and reduce the data to something like 5 to 10 gigabytes. But the reason that we feel, and we've gone into this in the paper, but for those at home, 32% of kids got better with smartphone addiction. Now, the reason that I feel that's actually a little bit lower than the gaming disorder one is probably because it takes a while to do that. If you're a parent going away and changing a mobile plan, that could take 1, 2, 3 months. And we follow them up in 6 weeks. So I feel like if we actually had followed up 12 or 16 weeks, that probably would have gotten better, but just a theory. The other way that parents can do that one is there are new smartphones coming on the market, things like Gme, G-MEE. I have no financial affiliation with Gme, by the way. They're an Australian smartphone for kids where essentially they allow you to put limits on this stuff at a hardware level, which is much different to the software that parents have been trying to use.
Hardware is the way to go. I'm convinced of that. Number 3, setting clear boundaries around Wi-Fi being turned off at bedtime. That doesn't feel like one that we need to go into in detail. It's, again, the conversation, we're turning off the Wi-Fi when it's time for bed so that you can get some sleep. I would have imagined, while it's not one of your strategies, that, I mean, there are still going to be some kids who will find a way to get access to the 4G, 5G network. Just removing devices from bedrooms is, I think, the ultimate way to deal with that. But your last 2, drawing up an agreement with your child about daily screen limits. I found it really interesting in your paper that was not one of the more effective strategies. I have my hypotheses, but why did you determine that was not always particularly effective? Obviously, it does work for some, by the way, but not particularly effective.
I think when we drilled down into exactly which strategy was working for gaming, was working for smartphone, was working on improving developmental impacts, which we measured as well, it gets a little bit muddled because some of them were using, strategy 1 and 3 and 5, and others were using 4 and 5. And so what happened is that when we got the 153 and we started to break it down into smaller groups like that, you ended up with smaller samples of maybe 15, 20. And so we shouldn't read too much into those individual ones. But yes, as a global statement, I think it's correct in saying that this data indicates that strategy 1, 2, and 3 that we've just talked about was perhaps more effective than getting into the nitty-gritty of consequences and things like that.
And the last one is that, having consequences. No surprise to you to hear me say that I'm not surprised that didn't work very well, because kids just... The more heavy-handed you are, the more that it damages the relationship, and the more it just pushes that unwanted behaviour underground. Those first 3, they're about conversations, they're about working together. and it just makes sense that they work. Brad, I love the work that you do. I think you do such an important job for parents who are really struggling with this. A question without notice, something that's popped into my head as we've been discussing. Brad, a couple of months ago, federal government, with the opposition's support, rushed through some legislation that's going to kick off towards the end of this year that will effectively ban kids from social media under the age of 16. Obviously, a lot of details still to come to light. There's a lot of work to be done before they're ready to roll this out. Brad, do you think this is a good thing?
Yeah, I mean, so I gave testimony at the end of last year at the Senate and the Joint Select Committee inquiries in Canberra. I'm on the record as saying that I do believe this is the right path to go. But what I also said in Canberra to the politicians was that even if we didn't do that, even if all we did was actually force the tech companies to give our parents parental software that works, that would be a fantastic start as well. So broadly speaking, I am in favour of this because I do believe that we have to send a clear message to parents that there are harms.
Dr. Brad Marshall is the unplugged psychologist. He spent over a day. Oh, sorry, I said Dr. Brad Marshall.
That's awesome. Yeah.
I'm just going to let it go, Brad, because any day now you're going to be Dr. Brad Marshall. Soon to be
as long as APRA don't come chasing
That's
me in
right.
the next 3 months, then we'll be okay.
I reckon we're safe here. The soon to be Dr. Brad Marshall, clinician, researcher, author, speaker, and all round tech guy expert. I really appreciate you being on the pod.
Thanks, Justin. Great to be here.
The Happy Families podcast is produced by Justin Rulon from Bridge Media. If you want more details about how you can help break your kid's screen or gaming addiction and disorder and dysfunction, check out Brad's website. We'll link to it in the show notes, or just Google Brad Marshall Unplugged Psychologist. A couple of great books with really useful ideas. We will also link to the paper that we've been discussing, so that for those of you who are more academically inclined, you can have a look at the breakdown of how that worked. And if you would like more information generally about making your family happier and how to have those conversations, check out happyfamilies.com.au.